Well, here we are, closing the distance once again. Another iteration of closing the distance. We're in the middle of this sermon series, summer road trip, which is kind of a brief and rather sporadic, to be honest, the journey through Matthew. We're missing a whole lot. We're kind of hitting the highlights in Matthew, but it's been really good. And so I think closing the distance is our opportunity to kind of discuss with the preaching pastor a little bit behind the scenes, what was in their thinking. And during the summer, we've actually opened up the floor to allow people to ask questions. And you get some pretty interesting questions. So before we get into the questions though, Jeff, again, for those who missed it or haven't watched it yet, just give us a brief synopsis of the sermon on Sunday, the scripture passage, and then kind of the main intent of what it was you're trying to convey.
Well, that was a long time ago, Dan.
It was. It was 2 days.
Um, so the passage was the feeding of the 5,000, where Jesus kind of miraculously hosts this meal for the crowds that come and find him in the wilderness. And the disciples say, let's send the crowds away to go to the local town so they can get food for themselves. And Jesus says, no, you give them something to eat. And they say, well, all we have are these 5 loaves and these 2 fishes. And which is kind of like remarkable that they even offer him that. And so then Jesus kind of miraculously hosts this meal where there's this multiplication, where everybody is fed and filled up, and then there are 12 baskets full of bread left over. And as I mentioned in the sermon, that this is one of the few places in Scripture, or one of the few stories in Scripture where are the first 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that this story is told in all 4. And in other accounts, you get some different details, that this is a young boy who brought the 5 loaves and 2 fishes, things like that. But it's a remarkable miracle and sign to who Jesus is. And so I think, and so I kind of took it theologically, less about the event and more about its symbolism and its meaning, how it's really the culmination of this expectation of the Hebrew people from the Old Testament that one day the Messiah, who is the anointed ones in the Old Testament are prophets, priests, and kings. You can read Calvin, Threefold Office of Christ, if you're interested in that. Jesus is the culmination of those 3 traditions. And the Messiah was one who would host a meal for the people in the wilderness, just like God had provided food for the Israelites on their sojourn, those 40 years from Egypt in captivity to the Promised Land. And then I looked at kind of its incarnate, or how it starts off a new story of expectation of a feast, a banquet, a meal that we will have together in heaven, this great image that Jesus often uses for a party that heaven will be. And that, and then the third kind of image is that Holy Communion that we celebrate once a month here at RPC, and the modern service we do every week, that that's a meal that kind of is a meal in expectation and hope for one day that we will celebrate in heaven together with Christ.
Yeah, awesome.
So there you go. That's what I tried to say. I don't know if I did.
You did. People may not be aware or may have forgotten, but in Matthew, we actually have 2 accounts of miraculous feedings. So there's the feeding of the 4,000 as well. And why do you think that is? And why is that significant? Or is the message the same in both of those?
I don't know. I haven't thought a lot about it, so I would probably say it's probably similar. Matthew is very concerned with a Jewish audience and his Jewish readership, and so maybe he may have included it to emphasize, basically the same 3 things of who Jesus is. But I mean, I mean, it's my argument that the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are answering the question, who is Jesus? Or, how do I make sense of who Jesus is? And so I think Matthew is really concerned to answer that question for folks who have a Jewish background.
So our first question then, and you've kind of touched on this a little bit, but so do you see anything symbolic or important about fish being one of the foods that are shared? Or is that
Uh,
just circumstance?
oh, that's a great question. I mean, the fish, was a sign for the early church. Um, you know, an image. I mean, Jesus often uses, you will be fishers of men. The early church or the early disciples, many of them were fishermen. And as Norman McLean's father said, they were they were most likely fly fishermen because they're the highest ranking fishermen, which I know speaks to your heart, Dan.
Absolutely. That's absolutely true. Me and Norman McLean are right there together.
And so I don't know, what do you think?
I think what more than likely, again, we think about the fish symbol, particularly in early Roman times, ichthus, and the symbol over the door. I think potentially early Christians picked up the Jesus use of that to symbolize him rather than vice versa. But I don't think the fish were necessarily symbolic specifically, but because he had used them as illustration and fed people with them and all that stuff, early Christians picked it up as a means of communicating, who they were, and particularly where in early Roman times where they had to be kind of surreptitious about, their proclaiming their faith. So,
Right. And when people ask this kind of question, like, I think it's a great question. I think, probably people who are more allegorical interpreters of scripture, something in the early church, Augustine,
right.
they would often take an image like a fish and really expound upon it wherein modern readers we go, what in the world? That doesn't make much sense. But they believe that the spirit could work and find meaning in in crevices of sentences that modern readers were looking more for context and like to summarize. So I think, if somebody finds a really deep imagery in like, I mean, you were a fisherman, right? So like
Right.
maybe you're
We
like,
say that in the past tense.
great point. Like maybe it really speaks to you. You're like, I really feel like I'm there. I was there with Jesus. Every time I go and fish, I remember this story. So I think God can speak to us in ways that maybe for non-fishermen, they're more like, I'm more of a bread maker. I'm more and I think that's okay.
So kind of segues into one of the other questions is talking about Norman McLean's short little story, and a river runs through it. It says, you quote the father saying that we seldom can help those who don't want our help. And you mentioned that we can come together as community believers, but many who need help are not there. So how do we point to God who loves us in Jesus Christ other than setting an example by how we live?
Well, I think we're called to love no matter what. But I think I, in some ways, are trying to let people off the hook from overcompensating, or like manipulative ministry, like as if I have, if it's all up to me, right? And and I think for a lot of us who are who are trying to be helpers, we have to point to what God has done in Jesus Christ always, but that there are some things we can't change. And we can try to, one of my favorite bands, the Hold Steady, they have this line that says, we can't save you, but we can put you in a place where you can save yourself. And and I think I always like that line, not that we can save in an ultimate sense, but like some people have to make a decision for themselves. And I think for us to try to coerce or manipulate people is a really unhealthy way to appreciate or to approach the Christian life and Christian ministry. And so that's kind of why I've always been drawn to A River Runs Through It, and that's that advice that his dad, Norman's dad, gives him, because in the story, he really loves his brother and wants the best for his brother and wants to save him. But he's also got to let his brother make his own decisions. And his dad, I think, gives him some really wise advice. And for those of I think for everybody who loves somebody who doesn't choose the right path, that's really hard for us to accept. But I think it's part of life that we have to accept it. I mean, you're a father of 4, and I'm sure like with your kids, like at some point you gotta let go and let God. Now my kids are young, so I still have control more. They haven't gotten to that
Well,
age.
at least you think you do.
That's true. At least they don't have driver's licenses
Right,
yet.
that's right. So you also mentioned in your sermon on Sunday, this is another question, that God promises Moses that he provide leaders for his people until the Messiah comes. So we have Jesus. Do we still need God to provide human leaders even in our own age, do you think?
Yeah,
That's still occurring?
yeah, I mean, I think God, well, again, God, okay, let's step back. So God makes this promise to Moses, and God does provide leadership, but also the people, the followers, get some say in the matter. So God says he raises up judges and stuff, and then the people say, "Well, we want a king," and God says, "I'll be your king." And they say, we want a human king. Why do you want a human king? Well, the neighboring countries have a king, so we should have a king. God says, that's a bad idea. Let me be your king. They say, no, we know better. We want a king. So God says, okay, I'll give you a king. Gives him Saul, right? And we see Saul starts off on a strong note and then takes, it goes downhill. David
Right.
comes along. He's the best king, and he even is a little
But not great.
dodgy, right? And then you have bad king, maybe a few high points. So in a similar way, in our own lives, in churches, in government, in businesses, we have leaders, and some of them are good and some of them are not so good. And I think as people, we should be discerning about who we elect, who we hire, who we choose to be our leaders, that they're not self-serving, that they serve, that they have a mission that we believe in, that they're to serve the people, not to serve themselves. Those kinds of things, I think, is helpful. What do you think, Dan?
Well, so historically, people have looked at certain leaders as being kind of God ordained or God uh, divinely established. Someone like, say, Abraham Lincoln, who really shouldn't have been elected by the way that, the election happened and all that stuff, and yet brought the nation out of, a complete, destruction ultimately. Um, and so do you think, other than him, are there other historical figures or maybe even people that are more recent that have been leaders? So MLK might be another one who wasn't like a president, but still demonstrated leadership that was, divinely inspired in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think yeah, I mean, well, Phil Jackson.
There we go.
uh, for Duke fans, Coach Krzyzewski.
Coach K, yeah.
um, yeah, like even like Martin Luther King Jr., a man with flaws, not
Right.
perfect. I mean, Michael Eric Dyson in his writing, who's a scholar who is at University of Pennsylvania, I mean, in his book on King, I mean, one of the things he talks a lot about King's flaws, because he says, I don't want people to think that King was like some angelic divine figure flying above, human concerns. No, he really wrestled with what it meant to be human, and he failed in a lot of areas of his life, like the
Yeah.
rest of us. And so um, I think, you know, eh, I'm a person. I think one of the reasons I chose to be Presbyterian was because of our polity. And by polity, it's the way we arrange ourselves, that we're very suspicious about individuals and people having too much power in one place because we believe that people are flawed. And if people, it's like that old adage, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think so we hold one another accountable for our failures and our dark side, our night side, and our flaws. Um, and that's for all leaders. And so we can have good leaders, but we rarely, if ever, have perfect leaders.
Right. Yep. So I don't remember this quote, but again, another question says, you said those who have tried to live a righteous life should not be surprised by who was at the party in heaven when they get there. Well, what did you mean by that? And who did you have any specific people in mind, or you're just open-minded to who might be there?
Well, okay, so I said that, or a version of that, in the context of the parable of the prodigal son, where the older brother stays outside the party because he's kind of angry that his dad has thrown a party for his younger brother who's been rebellious and has returned home. One of the best books I've ever read on this um, is this book by the Roman Catholic theologian Hans Urs von Balthasar, which is a great name. It's called "Dare We Hope That All Be Saved." Dare we hope that all be saved? And I like von Balthasar because he has this great uh, generosity of spirit that he calls people to, and I think um, that God is, if God can save me, then surely God can save anyone. And I think the grace that I've been shown, I want it to be shown to others. And so I won't be surprised if anyone um uh is there at the party in heaven. Um because I believe in a God full of grace and love. Why? Because God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, that whosoever perish, shall inherit eternal life, like John 3:16. Um, and so I think the other thing is I'm not the one who decides on who is saved.
Right.
That's in God's
And we're
eternal.
all grateful for that.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, seriously.
oh, absolutely. Me too. Yeah.
And I think and if we've been around people that think they're the ones who decide on who's in and who's out,
Mhm.
I think those are tough people to be around.
Yeah, for sure. There's a kind of a crass, a little bit crass, a little bit whatever, a skit by Rowan Atkinson about arriving in heaven and hell. That's kind of gets at that a little bit, but in a with British humor, so you can just you know what that means. But yeah, you can only
Check that out.
imagine.
I'm not familiar with that.
Oh
Rowan
yeah,
Atkinson.
yeah, yeah. All right, so. Uh, Is there anything else that one of the questions like, is there anything that you feel like you had to cut out of the sermon that you think that this would have been important to say, but I didn't have time or it didn't quite tie in?
Um, Not really. I really felt like I was kind of like knew what I wanted to say, and I may not have said it well or clearly, but I knew what I was going for. So I didn't leave actually, because a lot of times I do leave a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor.
Right.
And I kind of included I kind of knew what I wanted to go for, and I did it as best as I could for the time. Um, you know, I could have probably had more music references, but Semisonic closing time.
Always.
What a great tune. What a great tune. And actually, I did not realize, as I was reading about it, that he wrote it as a metaphor about the birth of his daughter, and that for his wife, it was the end of one part of their relationship, and then that with the birth of their daughter, it was the end, but also the beginning of a whole new phase in their relationship. And I thought that was a really cool discovery that I didn't know about before, and I've always loved that song. So it was kind of fun make that discovery.
Yeah, so how symbolic or important is that? The kind of the end of something is the beginning of something else. I mean, how should we view our spiritual lives in that light?
Well, I think like I think for a lot of us in those transitions, we choose one or the other. And if it's the end of something, sometimes we get s- we get so sad, we get so depressed, we get so wistful about what is gone that we forget that there's a future. And sometimes when there's a beginning, we get so excited about the future, we get so ready for what's next that we forget to grieve or to say goodbye to what's what we've left behind. I think for me, like I and maybe this is maybe other people aren't like this, but I feel like I err on one or the other. I feel like when I went to college, I remember when my parents dropped me off. I was so excited. I remember I think we went to a McDonald's in the University District in Seattle. And I remember getting in a fight with my mom, and I think it was subconscious, but I remember it now. I got in a fight with her because I think I didn't want to say goodbye. I didn't want to like feel the sadness of what I was
Right.
leaving behind. And it was easier for me to get in a fight and move on and go forward and with the expectation and anticipation of college and all that was ahead of me. And I think I really hurt my mom's feelings because I wasn't able to say, I love you, goodbye, thank you. I wasn't in touch with myself, right? And I wasn't mature. And so I think an emotionally healthy person can say goodbye. I love you. I grieve that this is one part of our life is ending, but there's all this stuff that I'm excited about coming forward.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. Having you saying that and clarifying that now makes me think of, Cindy and I moving down here. The transition was really becoming empty nesters for the first time. That's a huge transition. That's pretty, pretty difficult. It is. There's definitely a grieving period, particularly for the mothers in those situations.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Because
and then
how long did you have kids in your house?
well, technically we still kind of do, but we've got Mackenzie living with us. He's a student at Columbia, but I don't know, a long time, 20 odd, 25 years, something like that.
I
A
mean,
significant percentage of our
your
married
life.
life together. Yeah, yeah.
And I think, yeah, and I think, yeah, I hadn't really thought about that until you asked that question, but I think it's really hard for us to hold the tension of the
Yeah.
sadness of saying goodbye and the expectation and hope of the future and holding intention. And I think being a mature, a healthy person is being able to hold those together at the same time.
Yeah. Good.
Yeah,
I
from
think
a
that's a
job, I think about jobs, like
yeah,
making that transition in a healthy
yeah,
way. Uh, yeah,
yeah.
and
I mean,
relational.
again, even for our own community, thinking about, Lindsay's moving and we celebrate that and there is some grief in that, but also the celebration of, you
Right.
know, her new ministry and the doors that open here for other ministry.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that is just an essential and normal part of life.
Yeah. And you bring it up in the context of RPC. I think about like Lane Alderman, my predecessor.
Right.
I mean, all the struggle he went through courageously, and people were so grieving, and it was very awkward, not awkward, but it was challenging for me to really think through like how to come in. But then I thought about him being a pastor with Cy Mallard, who was his predecessor, who worshiped here for like 20 years. And they figured it out. And I think one of the great things at RPC is there's a history of really wrestling with both grief and hope in the future. That I think there's a lot of wisdom in our pews and in this community to help us move through situations like that.
So I think that's a good place to conclude the serious questions. What's coming up, next week? Where are we going? And I've got a couple other questions for you that, a little bit less serious.
Oh, now I'm worried. So we're going to look at Peter and in the boat when Jesus walks out to him. He's walking on water and he invites Peter to come out to him. So we're going to look at that. I have a hunch about where we're going to go with the sermon, but I'm not convinced. But that I don't want to give too much away, but I think it'll be a good Sunday to be here.
That's Wednesdays for you.
That's Wednesday.
All right. Well, good. So thank you. And so two quick questions. One, people, again, you alluded to, at least in one of the services, I don't know you did this in all the services because it was definitely an addition, but driving to RPC on Sunday morning, Memphis, kind of encouraged you in your song selection that goes a little bit against Courtney's love of music. And so they were curious about what Modest Mouse song Memphis liked.
It was their song Float On, which is kind of like their big radio hit. I think it came out like 2005, maybe 2002. So early mid 2000s. But yeah, my wife, she hates Modest Mouse.
Memphis has obviously heard it enough in the car with you when Courtney's not there that she's kind of, getting trained into what good music actually is. Is that how it is?
Yeah. I don't know. She's got a mind of her own.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So like she follows in the tradition of her mother. So so it was so random. That's why I mentioned it all the services, because I was kind of so flabbergasted. She had never she's requested songs. She loves like songs from Ice Age and
Right.
and Kanto and all this stuff. The Lion King. And so but I'd never played a song and it just kind of randomly came on on our Spotify playlist that she was like, I really like that song. I was like, what? So I was like, your mom.
How quickly did you go home and tell Courtney about that?
Well, I did. I went home and I told Courtney, I was like, guess what your daughter said when Modest Mouse Float On came. She said she would like that song. And Courtney said, it figures. I said, what? She goes, because they make music for children.
Courtney's always good with the comeback.
I was like, thanks.
All right. Well,
there we go.
Excellent. One other thing, how excited were you that the Tennessee Vols won the World Series, the College World Series yesterday? That's pretty exciting, right?
Yeah, I watched the opening inning when that guy hit that home run, Volunteers, and then I turned it. Actually, then I watched the hockey game, which I'm not like a hockey fan, but I wanted to see if Edmonton could come back and win in Game 7, but they lost. But I was excited for you, and I have some great Volunteer fans. I was excited for Peyton Manning.
Yeah, he was there.
Peyton, Dan Kreiss, the Kreiss family. Mike Buchanan, a friend from a long time, who's a huge Tennessee Volunteer fan. So
Steve Seibert had his Tennessee shirt on the other night at session. So, there's a few of us around, but
yeah,
that was good. They've been there 3 out of 4 years. It's the first time they've won, though.
That's really awesome.
Yeah.
That's really,
Go Vols. It was a good game.
Did they play 60? Did they win like 60 games? It was like,
yeah, that was 60 games.
Like, I didn't realize
that might be more than the Braves win this year. There's a little dig. But the Phillies are doing well. Whatever.
Oh, and you better
I'm gonna be
watch.
looking for a new job once this airs.
Yeah, Philadelphia fan.
Well, Jeff, again, thank you very much. We're looking forward to hearing the sermon again this week as we move through the book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, and it has been a real blessing, I think, to kind of focus on one gospel and really go through it and unpack it in a meaningful way like this. So, thank you for the idea, your thoughts, and your messages.
Thanks, Dan. I appreciate it, man. I'll see you soon.
All righty.
All right, brother. Bye-bye.